All great empires die. This is not a guess. It is a historical certainty. But they do not die the way we think. They are not primarily conquered by foreign armies or toppled by popular revolutions. They are undone from within by a simple, predictable, and fatal economic calculation. It isn't the failure of their armies. It is the failure of their math. It is the story of the Roman denarius, debased until it was worthless. It is the story of the Spanish Empire, drowning in inflationary silver. It is the story of the British pound, collapsing under the weight of 2 world wars. And today, the same systemic cracks and identical warning signs are flashing red for the world's current global reserve currency, the United States dollar. This is not a prediction of the future. This is the story of an ancient blueprint, a recurring pattern of how financial empires choose to die. Why does this pattern matter now? Because the global reserve currency is not just money. It is the underlying operating system for the entire world's economy. It is the asset central banks hold, the currency oil is priced in, and the foundation of international trade. When that system fractures, the shockwave is not a mild recession. It is a fundamental reordering of global power, wealth, and stability. The transition from one world order to the next is never peaceful. It is marked by financial volatility, resource scarcity, and often widespread conflict. Understanding this pattern is not an academic exercise. It is a vital tool for navigating the immense changes that are already beginning to unfold. For the past 80 years, the US dollar has held this dominant position. This status grants the United States what French politician Valéry Giscard d'Estaing famously called an exorbitant privilege, the ability to buy anything it wants from the rest of the world simply by printing its own currency. But this privilege is always tied to a fatal temptation, the accumulation of sovereign debt or money owed by the government itself. This exorbitant privilege is a double-edged sword. It allows a nation to live far beyond its means, financing its military presence across the globe and its domestic programs through the issuance of debt that the rest of the world must buy to participate in the global economy. But what happens when the world's faith in that system wavers? What happens when the amount of debt issued vastly outstrips the productive capacity of the economy that backs it? This is the critical inflection point. This is where the debt cycle moves from a manageable problem to an existential crisis. When a nation's sovereign debts grow so large that they can never realistically be paid back, history shows they face a choice. They can default honestly, a politically impossible act of self-destruction, or they can default secretly by printing money to pay the bills, thereby devaluing the currency for everyone who holds it. This is the path of monetary debasement. When we analyze the data, we see that every empire at the end of its life cycle has chosen this second path. The question, therefore, is not if the current cycle will turn, but how. Is the future a managed decline or a chaotic collapse? To find the blueprint for this process, we must look to Rome. The Roman Empire, at its height, was the undisputed master of the known world. Its currency, the denarius, was the global standard. For the first 2 centuries of the empire, this silver coin was a marvel of stability, containing over 95% pure silver. It was trusted from the forests of Germania to the markets of Egypt. This trust was the bedrock of the Pax Romana, the economic engine that funded the legions and fed the capital. But the seeds of its collapse were sown at its zenith. The original sin of Rome was a structural deficit. The empire simply became too large, its ambitions too great. The military required to guard thousands of miles of frontier was a constant, crushing expense. In the capital, the infamous bread and circuses, a vast welfare system of free grain and entertainment, was deemed politically essential to keep the urban populace from rioting. The tax base, primarily derived from agriculture, could not keep up with this relentless fiscal drain. Rome was spending far more than it earned, year after year. This created the crisis. The state was desperate for money. They faced the same choice every insolvent power faces: default or debase. To raise taxes further would risk revolt. To cut the military would invite invasion. To stop the grain dole would mean starvation and anarchy in the streets. The flawed choice became the only politically viable option: monetary deception. The process began subtly, almost invisibly. Around 64 AD, Emperor Nero made the first cut. He reduced the silver content of the denarius from nearly 100% to 93.5%. It was a small change, unnoticed by the public, but it allowed the treasury to mint more silver coins from the same amount of actual silver, pocketing the difference. It was a short-term fix, a way to pay the legions for another year. But in doing so, Nero had crossed a fatal line. He had established the precedent that the state's promise, the value of its money, could be broken to serve its immediate needs. Once this line was crossed, it became the default policy for every emperor who followed. The flawed choice became a habit, then an addiction. When we analyze the metallurgical data of the coins themselves, the pattern is undeniable. By the reign of Trajan, the denarius was down to 85% silver. Under Marcus Aurelius, it fell to 75%. The state was funding its wars and its welfare by progressively robbing the savings of its own citizens. The mechanism accelerated. In 215 AD, Emperor Caracalla introduced a new coin, the Antoninianus. It was introduced as being worth 2 denarii. But when we examine the coin, we see the deception. It contained only the silver of 1.5 denarii. This wasn't just debasement, it was an act of financial fraud, a Roman version of quantitative easing, creating currency from nothing to paper over unserviceable debts. The inevitable consequence was the complete destruction of trust, and with it, the Roman economy. This wasn't a slow decline, it was a catastrophic failure. The public was not stupid. They quickly realized the new coins were worthless and began hoarding the old, pure silver coins. This is a classic economic law. Bad money drives out good. Inflation, a concept previously unknown to the Roman world, exploded. Why would a farmer sell his grain for a coin that would be worthless tomorrow? By the mid-3rd century, the denarius, once the symbol of global power, was a bronze coin with a paper-thin silver wash. Its silver content had fallen to less than 0.5%. The result was the crisis of the 3rd century. Society disintegrated, trade between provinces ground to a halt. It was too risky. Soldiers, refusing to be paid in worthless scrip, mutinied, murdering emperors, and installing their own in a desperate search for anyone who could pay them in actual gold or food. The economy reverted to primitive barter. The Roman middle class, the backbone of the empire, was entirely wiped out, their savings rendered meaningless. When the Emperor Diocletian finally tried to fix the problem, his only solution was to issue the edict on maximum prices, a draconian law setting fixed prices for everything from eggs to labor. It failed instantly. You cannot solve a crisis of currency debasement with laws. The market simply went underground. This is the blueprint. The barbarian invasions were not the cause of Rome's fall. They were the consequence. The barbarians simply walked over the corpse of an empire that had already committed financial suicide. Rome's fall demonstrates in perfect tragic detail the 3-step pattern: a structural crisis, a flawed choice to debase, and the inevitable consequence of total societal collapse. You might be tempted to dismiss the fall of Rome. That was a pre-industrial empire, you might say. It was a primitive world of silver and bronze, completely detached from our modern, globalized financial system. This is a common and dangerous misconception. The technology of money changes, from chiseling silver coins to programming digital ledgers, but the human impulse and the mathematics of sovereign debt remain identical. The mechanism of collapse is the same. To prove this, we don't need to look back 2 millennia. We only need to look at the 20th century and the fall of the last global empire, Great Britain. For over 100 years, the pound sterling was the world's reserve currency. It was the denarius of its day. The sterling area, a vast block of nations from Australia to South Africa that pegged their currencies to the pound and held their reserves in London, spanned the globe. In the 19th century, when you said "as good as gold," you meant the British pound. This financial dominance, guaranteed by the Royal Navy, was the engine of the British Empire. But beneath this veneer of absolute power, the same structural flaw that doomed Rome was metastasizing. The original sin for Britain was not a bloated welfare state, but the devastating back-to-back costs of 2 world wars. Britain emerged victorious in 1945, but it was financially hollowed out. It had funded its survival by borrowing astronomical sums, primarily from the United States, and by liquidating its vast overseas investments. Its national debt soared to a staggering 270% of GDP. The empire was, in simple terms, completely and utterly broke. It had transformed from the world's largest creditor to the world's largest debtor. This new reality was codified at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. The US dollar, explicitly backed by gold at $35 an ounce, would become the new, undisputed global reserve currency. The pound sterling, however, was allowed to persist as a secondary reserve. It was given a privileged, fixed exchange rate to the dollar. This arrangement masked Britain's underlying insolvency, allowing it to maintain the illusion of power. This set the stage for the flawed choice. Britain's choice was one of denial. It attempted to maintain the fiction of its pre-war greatness. It established a massive new welfare state at home, while simultaneously trying to fund a globe-spanning military presence. It was living a lie. The nation faced a gaping balance of payments deficit. It was importing far more than it was exporting, and the world was beginning to notice. To fund this deficit and its new social programs, the Bank of England engaged in the modern equivalent of coin clipping. It printed money and suppressed interest rates, creating a quiet, persistent inflation that slowly eroded the real value of every pound held in reserve by foreign nations. The inevitable consequence, the loss of confidence moment, was coming. The crisis of the 3rd century for the British Empire arrived in 1956. The Suez Crisis was the match that lit the powder keg. When Egyptian President Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain, France, and Israel responded with military force. The act was a final, nostalgic spasm of imperial power. But the world had changed. The United States, furious at the move, did not back its ally. Instead, it did something far more devastating. It used its financial power as a weapon. The Eisenhower administration signaled it would sell its vast reserves of pound sterling bonds. This was the equivalent of a global margin call. It triggered a full-blown panic, a run on the pound. Central banks and private investors, who, when we analyzed their motives, saw clearly that Britain was militarily overextended and financially insolvent, stampeded for the exits. They dumped their pounds en masse, trying to convert them to US dollars, a currency backed by gold, before the pound collapsed. The Bank of England's reserves hemorrhaged. Within days, the British government was brought to its knees, forced into a humiliating military withdrawal and a massive devaluation of its currency. The Suez Crisis was the empire's death certificate. It wasn't the military failure that ended the empire, it was the financial one. The crisis brutally exposed the fact that the pound sterling was an empty promise, a fiat currency backed by nothing but unpayable debts. The fall of the pound sterling proves the rule. It confirms that the Roman blueprint is not an ancient relic. The trigger was different. A world war, not just frontier defense, but the mechanism was identical. A structural crisis, massive war debt, led to a flawed choice, printing money and maintaining a false peg, which culminated in a catastrophic consequence, a run on the currency and a loss of confidence event. The British Empire didn't end with a bang. It ended with a phone call from the US Treasury, announcing that the checks would no longer be cashed. So, what is the unchanging mechanism? We have examined two colossal empires, Rome and Britain, separated by nearly 2,000 years. One operated on precious metals, the other on global paper. Yet their terminal decline followed an identical script. This is because the fall of an empire's currency is not an accident. It is a predictable four-stage process. The technology and the justifications change, but the imperial debt cycle itself is a law of financial gravity. When we strip away the historical details, the pattern becomes crystal clear. It always follows these four steps. Step 1. The crisis of structural deficits. It always begins here. The imperial power, at the peak of its influence, has overextended itself. It has a global military to fund, complex supply chains to protect, and a demanding population at home that expects a certain standard of living, often subsidized by the state. The crisis is the moment the math no longer works. The nation's productive economy, its tax base, can no longer pay for its enormous obligations. A structural deficit becomes permanent. The government is spending far more than it earns every single year and must borrow to cover the difference. This is Rome funding the legions and the grain dole. It is Britain funding a global navy and a new welfare state on a shattered post-war economy. Step 2. The easy way out. An empire in this position faces a brutal choice. It can accept reality and choose the hard path. Massive austerity, deep cuts to military and social spending, and significant tax increases. This path is politically toxic. It guarantees riots, lost elections, and an immediate painful reduction in global power. So it chooses the easy way out. It chooses to default on its debts, not honestly but secretly. It funds its deficits by creating new currency from thin air. For Rome, this was clipping the silver from the Denarius. For Britain, it was printing pounds to maintain a false exchange rate. For a modern economy, it is done by the central bank, which buys the government's debt with newly created digital money. The name changes, but the act is identical. It is monetary debasement. Step 3. The "this time is different" excuse. This debasement cannot be admitted. To do so would instantly trigger the final collapse. Therefore, the easy way out must be packaged in a sophisticated new narrative. This is the crucial stage of intellectual justification. The state and its allied financial institutions invent new theories to explain why this time is different, why the old rules no longer apply. Emperor Caracalla didn't say, "I am debasing your money." He said, "I am giving you a new coin, the Antoninianus." The Bank of England didn't say, "We are printing worthless pounds." It said, "We are managing our currency peg." In the 21st century, we are told it is quantitative easing, a temporary emergency measure to provide liquidity. Or it is modern monetary theory, a complex idea which argues that a government that prints its own currency cannot go broke. These are the modern names for the Antoninianus. They are the excuses used to justify the printing. Step 4. The loss of confidence and collapse. This is the final human-driven act. The excuses work for a while, but reality always catches up. The public, the markets, and other nations are not stupid. They begin to see the deception. They notice that their food costs more, that their savings buy less. They see the relentless creation of new money, and just like the Roman farmer hoarding his old silver coins, they begin to lose faith. This loss of confidence is the kill switch. It is a phase shift, like water turning to ice. One day, the currency is trusted. The next, it is not. This is what happened at Suez, when global central banks realized the pound was a lie and dumped it. It is what happened in the 3rd century Rome, when the market rejected the worthless bronze silver coins. This is the run on the currency. Inflation, once dismissed as transitory, becomes persistent. Foreign nations seek alternatives. The empire's exorbitant privilege evaporates. The currency, and with it, the empire's power, collapses. This four-step cycle is the mechanism. It is the engine of imperial decline. So where are we today? We now possess the four-step checklist, the recurring mechanism of imperial finance. We are no longer lost in the noise of daily headlines and partisan political battles. We have a diagnostic tool grounded in history. Let's apply it dispassionately to the current global reserve power, the United States. Step 1. The crisis of structural deficits. Has the United States entered a state of permanent structural deficits? The answer is an undeniable check. When we analyze the data, the U.S. national debt has exploded from roughly $5 trillion at the turn of the millennium to over $34 trillion today. This is not a partisan phenomenon. It is a multi-generational trend of fiscal imbalance. It is the baked-in structural cost of what historians call guns and butter, a global military presence in over 80 countries, combined with a vast and growing domestic social spending apparatus, primarily in entitlements. The 2008 financial crisis was the first major accelerator, requiring a massive state bailout of the banking system. The 2020 COVID pandemic was the second, unleashing trillions in stimulus spending and relief. The result is that the U.S. government now consistently spends trillions more than it collects in taxes, with annual deficits projected to continue indefinitely. The math no longer works. The structural crisis is here. Step 2. The easy way out. Faced with this unpayable debt load and a structural deficit, has the United States chosen the hard path of austerity? Has it fundamentally slashed its military and domestic spending or radically raised taxes on its populace? No, it has, just as Rome and Britain did, chosen the easy way out, monetary creation. But it is done with a clinical sophistication that would have astounded Emperor Caracalla. It is called quantitative easing, QE. Let's be very clear about what this mechanism is. When the government needs to borrow money, it issues bonds. In a healthy system, those bonds are bought by private investors, pension funds, and other nations. But when the sheer volume of debt becomes too large for the market to absorb without choking on it, the central bank, the Federal Reserve, steps in. Starting in 2008 and accelerating to unimaginable levels in 2020, the Federal Reserve began buying its own government's debt, with money it created digitally, out of nothing. When we analyze the Federal Reserve's balance sheet, we see it swelled from under $1 trillion in 2007 to nearly $9 trillion by 2022. This is the easy way out on an industrial scale. It is the modern Antoninianus. It is a monetary deception, a way to fund the structural deficit by creating new currency, effectively socializing the government's debt onto the public's balance sheet through the slow, hidden tax of currency devaluation. Step 3. The "this time is different" excuse. This massive monetary intervention could not be called printing money. To do so would be to admit the game and instantly trigger Step 4. So, as our model predicts, a new lexicon, a sophisticated narrative, was invented to justify it. We were told QE was a temporary emergency tool to provide liquidity to the banking system. We were told it was necessary to stimulate aggregate demand and fight deflation. Then, when the predictable consequence of this unprecedented monetary expansion, inflation, arrived in 2021, the narrative shifted again. The public was assured by the highest financial authorities that the inflation was transitory. It was blamed on supply chain bottlenecks, pent-up demand, or corporate greed. These were all, in effect, excuses. They were the modern articulation of the 3rd century Roman excuse, a way to deflect attention from the root cause, the debasement of the currency itself. Step 4. The loss of confidence. This brings us to the final critical question. Where are we in this final stage? We are not in a full-blown collapse, but when we analyze the data, we are, for the first time since the 1970s, seeing the clear and unambiguous symptoms of this stage beginning to emerge. The loss of confidence is not a single event, it is a process. The first symptom is domestic. The transitory inflation narrative officially failed. The public now expects inflation. They are losing trust in the currency as a stable store of value. When we analyze consumer sentiment and savings data, we see this breakdown of trust. This is the 21st century version of the Roman farmer hoarding his old pure silver coins. It is the American citizen watching their grocery bill rise 30% in 3 years, realizing their paycheck buys demonstrably less year after year. The second, and far more dangerous symptom, is the external loss of confidence. For decades, the world had no choice but to hold US dollars and US debt. This was the exorbitant privilege. But this is changing. We are now seeing the first organized, strategic moves toward de-dollarization. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, now expanding to include major oil producers like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, are openly creating frameworks to trade with each other in their own local currencies, bypassing the dollar system entirely. This is not a conspiracy. It is a rational response from competing powers. When we analyze the actions of foreign central banks, we see they are buying physical gold at the fastest pace in recorded history. They are not doing this because they trust the dollar. They are doing it because they don't. They are seeking a neutral reserve asset, an exit from a fiat system where their savings can be diluted by another nation's printing press or seized via sanctions, as happened to Russia's dollar reserves in 2022. That event, more than any other, was the Suez moment for the 21st century dollar standard. It was a signal to the entire world that US dollar reserves were not just an asset, but a potential liability, a weapon in a geopolitical conflict. The trust is eroding. We are not at the end of step 4, but we are unambiguously in it. History is not a perfect mirror, but its echoes are unmistakable. The Roman citizen watching the denarius turn to bronze, the British official watching the pound sterling collapse at Suez, and the modern family watching their savings evaporate at the grocery store are all experiencing the final, predictable act of the same play. In every case, leaders claimed this time is different. In every case, they were wrong. The forces of financial gravity, of sound money, and of human trust are more powerful than any political decree or economic theory. When we analyze the historical record, we see that the end of this cycle is not a mystery. It is inevitable. The only remaining question is the nature of that end. History presents two distinct paths forward. The first is the chaotic collapse, the path of Rome. This is a sudden, disorderly disintegration of trust and authority, leading to hyperinflation, a breakdown of complex trade, and a long, difficult period of societal reorganization, a dark age. The second is the managed decline, the path of Great Britain. This is a long, slow, and relatively peaceful handover of global power. The currency cedes its reserve status, the nation's global influence wanes, and the domestic standard of living gradually adjusts to its new, smaller place in the world. It is a national bankruptcy, but a managed one. Today, we stand at the same fork in the road. The pattern is accelerating. The decisions made in the coming years will determine which of these two paths the current world order will take. This is no longer an academic debate. It is the most significant economic and geopolitical story of our lifetime. To understand this transition is to be prepared for it. Subscribe to this channel because as this next uncertain chapter of history is written, you will want to understand exactly what is happening, and most importantly, why.